Hey, so I just wanted to make a quick note to say that this video, along with all the rest in this super long series, um, these were created back at the end of 2021 and beginning of 2022. And so you'll hear me talking to a specific group of people, and they are the wonderful ladies in my private Facebook group called The Branches. And I had done this, well, mostly for me, but as also a little something for them, for if anyone else was in the same boat I was when in regards to salvation and having assurance of salvation. So I hope you enjoy this, and let me know if you have any questions or want to talk further on the topic. Talk to you later, guys. Bye. Hello, welcome to day 3 of week 3 for our study of assurance of salvation. So far this week, with our study of vital sign number 2, confession of sin, we have learned the importance of God's holiness and seeing our sinful nature in the light of His holiness, and not allowing ourselves to be deceived, but walking in the light and confessing sin. And we're going to go into a little bit more about the confession of sin, which is our first subheading today. So it says, contrary to the counterfeit Christian, the one who is genuinely converted regularly confesses his sin. He is convicted of his sin and agrees with God about it, which is what confession is all about. John continues in 1 John 1:9. If we confess our sins, He is faithful and righteous to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. The one who walks in the light is aware of his sin and must have relief from his guilt by confessing it to God. In the light, his sin is clearly exposed. He senses his need for forgiveness and delights in confessing it to God in order to receive His cleansing. Confessing sin is common to all believers. Confession means to agree with God about our sin. It is acknowledging our sin to God, admitting that we have violated His holiness, and asking for His forgiveness. Confession is the act by which we assume responsibility for our sin and deal with it God's prescribed way. Until sin is confessed, there can be no true fellowship with a holy God. So whatever happened to sin? That's our next subheading. It says, our world has a skewed view of sin. Someone has written that man calls it an accident, but God calls it an abomination. Man calls it a blunder, God calls it a disease. Man calls it a chance, God calls it a choice. Man calls it an error, God calls it an enmity. That one's hard for me to say, an enmity. Man calls it a fascination, God calls it a fatality. Man calls it an infirmity, God calls it an iniquity. Man calls it a luxury, God calls it leprosy. Man calls it a liberty, God calls it lawlessness. Man calls it a trifle, God calls it a tragedy. Man calls it a mistake, God calls it madness. Man calls it weakness, God calls it willfulness. Another one hard for me to say. God calls it willfulness. So, our next subheading is necessary for salvation. Entrance into God's kingdom is marked by confession of sin. Jesus established this when He began the Sermon on the Mount by saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." That's Matthew 5:3-4. And it took me a while to figure that out. maybe it's just me, I don't know. But when he says, blessed are the poor in spirit, and blessed are those who mourn. These are people who are in turmoil over their sin, and they're mourning over their sin. It says, for they shall be comforted, because their sin had separated them from God. This says, declaring one's spiritual bankruptcy and weeping over personal sin is necessary for entrance into his kingdom. In the parable of the Pharisee and the tax gatherer, the self-righteous Pharisee never saw his own sin and remained outside God's kingdom. And this is in Luke 18:9-14, and I recommend that you guys read that. And it says, but the tax gatherer was so overwhelmed by his own sin, he sensed his own unworthiness to come before a holy God, and was unwilling to even lift up his eyes to heaven because of his separation from God. He beat his breast, condemning himself, and said, God, be merciful to me, the sinner. He saw himself not merely as a sinner, but the sinner. No one could be further away from God, he assumed, than he. Such a humbling confession of sin marks everyone who is justified before God. After conversion, the confession of sin continues throughout one's Christian life. Consider the Apostle Paul. As he grew spiritually, so did awareness of his own sin. First, he saw himself as the least of the apostles. And that's 1 Corinthians 15:9. Then, the very least of all saints, in Ephesians 3:8. And finally, he saw himself as the foremost of all sinners, in 1 Timothy 1:15. As Paul matured in the Lord, he grew in the awareness of his sin. This is the mark of one who is truly saved. The difference between the true and false convert is not whether or not they sin. They both will sin, but when the genuine believer lapses into sin, he loathes it. The counterfeit Christian leaps into sin and loves it. So notice, one lapses into sin and loathes it. One leaps into sin and loves it. The real Christian confesses sin. The false one covers it up. And take a look at Proverbs 28:13. That's referenced. Making God a liar. The one who fails to confess his sin, no matter how much that person may claim to be a Christian, is not a genuine believer. The apostle writes in 1 John 1:10, if we say we have not sinned, we make him a liar, and his word is not in us. One may claim to be a Christian, but if there is no awareness of personal sin, that person is not saved. With perfect insight, he may see sin in the lives of others, or may protest against the ills of society. But if he is blind to the wretched sins of his soul, he is lost. Until there is confession of his own sin, there is no forgiveness for his sin. What is worse, when he says, I have not sinned, he makes God a liar. Without equivocation, God says he has sinned. The person who denies his sin reminds me of the college freshman who went to the dorm laundry room with his dirty clothes all bundled up in an old sweatshirt. He was so embarrassed by how dirty his clothes were that he never opened the bundle. Instead, he pushed the bundle into a washing machine, and when the machine stopped, he pushed the same wadded up bundle into a dryer. Finally, he took the still unopened bundle back to his room, where he discovered that his clothes had gotten wet, then dry, but not clean. Even so, many go through the external empty motions of religion, concerned with what others think, careful not to reveal their sin, but they never bring their sin out into the open before God. They never confess their sin and therefore never come clean before God. If such a self-deceived person mourns over his sin, it is only because of what it has done to hurt himself, not because of how it has grieved God. For example, Judas was sorry for his sin, but hanged himself in remorse and went straight to hell. Such a person never sees that it was his sins that nailed Christ to the cross. Always playing the blame game, he is quick to point out sin in others, but never acknowledges his own sins to God, much less be broken over them. And our final subheading today is an advocate with God. Returning to the true believer who confesses his sins, John explains the great provision for sins that in the atonement of Jesus Christ. Even though believers will continue to sin, God has provided the means by which his holy anger toward our sins may be appeased. 1 John 2, 1-2, he says, "My little children, I am writing these things to you so that you may not sin. And if anyone sins, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous, and he himself is the propitiation for our sins, and not for ours only, but also for those of the whole world." Speaking in legal terms, John says that when charges are brought against us, we have a lawyer to represent us before God. Seated at the right hand of God, Jesus intervenes as our defense attorney, defending us against all charges brought by Satan. Although the devil accuses us before God day and night for our sins, see Revelation 12:10, Jesus is our advocate, pleading his blood before the Father. The Son's perfect sacrifice at the cross has propitiated, meaning satisfied or appeased, the righteous anger of God against our sins. As Christians, we will continue to sin even after our conversion, but Jesus Christ remains our advocate. He died for our sins and is the pacifier of God's wrath toward our sins. Even though we are guilty, we confess our sin and are cleared of all charges and immediately forgiven. A genuine believer will habitually practice a lifestyle of confessing his sins and receive God's full acquittal through the blood of Christ. And we can just give so many thanks to God and to Christ that we can go to him and know that we can be forgiven, just the whole thing is beautiful. That's what I always say. Everything's beautiful, but it is. The gospel is absolutely beautiful. And but that's where we're going to stop today, you guys. And tomorrow, we'll just go over a little bit of, so where do you stand? And I'll go through a little bit of questions. And there's an interesting story called What Then? And then we'll go through the last subheading of What Now? So I hope you're enjoying this. And please, again, let me know if you have any questions or comments. And I encourage you to do some of your own studies and let me know what you're learning from this in the comments. I would love to see that. Take care, you guys. I'll see you again tomorrow. Bye.